Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Technology Insight series here at SAP Insider. I'm here with Tim Roden, Solutions Principal for Sales and Use Tax at Sovos. And we're here to talk about indirect tax compliance, global tax management, and all the complexity that is surrounding this hot button issue for our community. My name is Ogo Waniwu, Research Director for SAP Insider, focusing on financial management. And I'd like to introduce Tim. How are you doing, Tim?
Very well, Ogo. Thank you. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you. We appreciate the sponsorship and partnership with Sovos, and really excited to just have this conversation and gather some insight from you regarding just this hot button issue, a topic that's really resonating with our community right now. But first, why don't we start by getting an introduction, understanding the background, and so we have context for this expertise that you're providing.
Sure, thanks. And as you mentioned, my role here is Solution Principal for Sales and Use Tax line of business. At Sovos, we're actually divided up into 4 distinct lines of business, although we all work closely together. I've been with Sovos for going on 8 years now, and most of that time has been focused customer facing, right? I worked as a sales engineer and managed the sales engineering team. And so a lot of my conversations have been directly with organizations like your customer base here, like the audience, who is leveraging SAP and has indirect tax challenges and is looking for better ways to be more compliant, be more efficient. And for the past 2.5 years now, I've been focused on our line of business, trying to figure out, where it is we can go as an organization to help these organizations and kind of direct that strategy. So I've been involved in the industry and seen a lot of different trends, and happy to share some of those with you in the audience today.
Sales and use tax, top of the, really one of the principal regulatory updates that's really impacting the workloads of our tax community. And so, when we talk about kind of the variations and variability of tax jurisdictions and tax rates and product taxability, talk about how that impacts tax determination and really makes tax determination complex, and then how Sovos, your solution really supports and enables simpler tax, simpler, how you enable that.
Yeah, I mean, and tax determination is critical because it's, at the time of sale, the time you're conducting business with your customer, you got to make sure that you get that tax correct for a couple of different reasons. One, you want to make sure that you're compliant with the jurisdictional laws where you operate, so that you're not running into any audit penalties. And so you've got to make sure that based on where it is you're selling that product, what that product is, and who the customer you're selling to, you're getting the tax correct. And on the flip side, it's also really important to your customer relationship, right? To your business reputation, to make sure that when you apply tax on a transaction to a customer of yours, you're doing it correctly. We've seen instances with clients where they've come to us because they've lost business because they have consistently provided a poor experience to their customers. Either they're not getting the rate correct in the jurisdiction where the client is because of the address of the location. It's inside or outside of city limits, and the client comes back and says, hey, you keep charging me city tax, I'm outside of city limits. That creates a negative customer experience for our customers, for our customers' customers. And the other challenge is around exemptions, right? So as organizations grow and they start to do, if you think about an e-commerce retailer, they grow and they start to do more business-to-business transactions, or the traditional manufacturing space who had been doing a lot of business-to-business transactions and selling to exempt customers. Well, now with the passage of Wayfair, you've got where maybe you didn't have the obligation to charge tax to a specific client in a specific location because you didn't have Nexus there. Now with Wayfair passing, you have economic Nexus there. So you say, okay, I'm selling into Arizona. I didn't have Nexus there. I do now. I got to make sure I charge tax. But your client in Arizona has an exemption certificate. That throws a whole new wrinkle into it. So it's making sure that you're providing a positive customer experience and that you're not having tax be a reason why you're kind of impacting your reputation with your clients. So it's critical on both ends. And I think we see, because then it has a trickle down effect, right? If you're not collecting the tax correctly, you're opening yourself up to potential audit risks. And so what we've seen in the space is that many organizations kind of who've been in the sales and use tax space for a while, manufacturing organizations, they're very risk adverse. And so they'll focus on making sure that they are compliant. But what they typically have done in order to do that is throw a lot of manual effort at that process. And so it's trying to balance, how can we be compliant while also being operationally efficient? And it's just something that's really difficult to do without automation. And that's where, again, solutions like ours come into play with helping to determine the appropriate taxability based on all those factors, customer, location, product, or service, and then consolidating the information so you have clear visibility into why tax was applied to each transaction so that you can figure out how to file that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We see, what you're talking about reflected in our data, especially with regards to automation, right? We see that our community data from our automation in finance report showed that tax and indirect tax-based processes were one of the most difficult for our community to automate. And again, that speaks to some of the challenges and complexity that you're surfacing here in this conversation. Separate from that, we also see that our community is very frustrated with the level of automation across their organizations. And it starts with manually intensive accounting processes. And, you just touched on that. And so can you talk about just the automation of indirect tax lifecycle and the impact it can have on tax managers, tax teams, and how Sovos plays a part in that?
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge with the inability to automate is just the number of different systems that organizations are leveraging to conduct business. So you're going to have SAP as your ERP and as your system of record, but oftentimes organizations will have additional consumer-facing channels. So you'll have an e-commerce platform, or you have a point of sale or an order management system that helps facilitate fulfillment. On the purchasing side, you may be leveraging a procure-to-pay automation solution like Ariba or Coupa. And so you've got all these different systems that are transacting, and tax is being applied at that time of sale. And then oftentimes it's kind of being consolidated into SAP. And that may not have the detail required to actually do your tax compliance. So what we see organizations sometimes do is they're taking extracts out of multiple systems and an extract out of SAP, and they're doing their reconciliation within Excel, trying to figure out, okay, here's the extract from my e-commerce channel. Here's the obligation that my use tax obligation that the Ariba system calculated, and balancing that against the system of record in SAP, which actually has the ledger entries, but you're trying to figure out what transactions actually make up those entries, because when you go to file your taxes, you need to make sure that you're separating out by jurisdiction where the obligation is. So it becomes a manual process, and it's the most visible pain point that we see with organizations is that monthly or quarterly compliance process where they've got to get all that information. But again, it starts, if you're not calculating tax correctly,
right,
that's contributing to the headache that you have when you're actually doing the compliance. So it is really challenging if you're not using automated solutions. If you're not, part of the benefit that we provide, and we with clients, we've helped implement solutions that has all the tax obligation flowing through one system, so that when you're getting ready to do your reconciliation, you can extract all of your tax information out of a Sovos solution. You can do a comparison to your ledgers with SAP, and you can see the detail within the Sovos system, and it makes it easier to go back and do your investigation. But if you're having to look at multiple systems, it becomes a little bit of a wild goose chase. And that's really, when we look at where large organizations over $2 billion are spending the majority of their time, and where they have the most pain, it's not being non-compliant. The majority of their time is spent making sure they are compliant, like that's throwing manual hours at that process. And that's what they need help cleaning up.
And that speaks to, some of the really hot button topics for our community in terms of their core ERP, right? And in our internal data, we see that organizations migrating, moving to S4HANA, look at that as a really big opportunity for indirect tax automation and to simplify their, the tax complexity end to end across their system. And so, why don't we talk about, how Sovos supports and enables organizations, SAP organizations that now have to migrate to SAP S4HANA and now have to consider tax and indirect tax, especially indirect tax, as a part of that conversation.
Yeah, and I wish it were just as simple as, upgrading your iPhone operating system, right? Just pressing a button while you keep it updates. And I know that SAP is doing a lot of things to try and make that easier. But, some of these organizations have had an SAP deployment for 10, 15, 20 years, right? And some of those organizations have also had a tax engine plugged in there for that long. And just a lot of the complexity comes in the number of customizations that they've put into that system. And so that's where, it does really require a little bit of analysis, investigation to make sure that, we understand what's the behavior right now in terms of the types of transactions you're running through SAP and the different rules you have in place for how you want to make sure that tax is applied, and kind of painting that picture of what it's going to look like when you move. So, it's interesting. We've been having this conversation with clients for what seems like forever now, but I guess it's only been the last 3 or 4 years, and now they still have another 4 or 5 years in which to get there. So it's going to be a decade-long conversation. But the other piece of complexity is that oftentimes organizations, like you mentioned, are looking to consolidate onto S4HANA, and it's not always just consolidating off of ECC. They may be running an old Oracle system, an old Great Plains system, a system that's running on AS400. And that's what we see often is we understand where we want to get to. We want to get on S4HANA. We want to have all these great new features. We want to run central finance to make sure we have a consolidated view. But how do we get there? And, we've actually had some success with some clients and definitely in partnerships with some of our, different advisory firms that we work with to help tell that story. And one client in particular, had a plan to move to S4HANA, but they also ran a Microsoft AX system. They also ran an Oracle R12 system, and they also had a custom system. And they eventually were going to move everything to S4HANA, but in the process, they said, we want to make sure that from a tax perspective, we're able to consolidate all of our obligation. And so Sovos was able to help. We have a integration and certified integration with S4HANA and ECC. So we're able to help move that portion of their business and apply the tax rules correctly. So everything running through S4HANA was running through the Sovos engine. But then we're also able to help connect to some of the legacy systems and batch in data. So even though they were still running legacy systems, they were able to have one consolidated view of all their tax obligation in Sovos. And what they were also doing is they were summarizing their data out of these legacy systems to get into central finance. But again, that's all summarized information. Right. So to have that, central finance be your repository for your summary of information, your summary of accounts, and then the Sovos system be the detail behind the tax obligation broken out by plant, by location, by source system, really help them with that visibility and help ease that move. And eventually we can just, we've started to cut off those batch processes as they move everything else to S4HANA. So that's an approach that we've taken that's been successful with a handful of clients. But every migration really does deserve some analysis and some planning. But there are solutions out there that can help you realize the benefits you want out of that move.
Well, that's a really great example and insight into that particular customer's challenges and how they addressed it. And and why I find it interesting is because it's reflective of what we see just high level from our community, where again, just based on some of our data, we see SAP inside our organizations reducing their ERP footprint, right? Mm-hmm. But they're expanding the number of source systems they're running their business processes through, and they're having to do, and they're doing that as they kind of evaluate and execute their migration to S4HANA, and so again, I thought that example is really relevant for our community.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think your S4 HANA, one of the goals is to make the ERP more interoperable with other systems, right?
Mhm.
As opposed to ECC is kind of, it's the standard, but it's very difficult, and a lot of organizations have spent a lot of money trying to make sure they can integrate their Salesforce Commerce Cloud platform or their procure to pay platform, whatever it is, to make sure the data flows into SAP
Right.
properly. And yeah, we've seen more of a focus on interoperability and integration, ease of integration with S4 HANA. But from a tax perspective, one of our best practices is, even though ultimately all the data is going to flow through S4 HANA, it is critical to make sure that each customer facing or transactional system is integrated with the tax engine to make sure that the determination is happening without having to hop through SAP to get tax. But it also needs to be consistent. So especially if I'm taking orders on an e-commerce system and I'm fulfilling them out of my SAP, I need to make sure that the tax treatment on the sales order that I present to the client is the same as the invoice that's generated out of SAP. So it's really critical that organizations leverage the same integration to the same tax engine from these disparate systems.
Global multinational companies, enterprise companies that are selling from Europe, from APAC, uh, from outside the US into the US. How is that economic nexus impacting them?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. This is something we're starting to see more and more of. Again, Sovos being a global organization, and we have relationships with organizations for other solutions across the world, and we are definitely starting to see European-based or APAC-based organizations who have no physical presence in the United States, or maybe a single small division in the United States, but based on how they're selling, they now have economic nexus in different jurisdictions, and so they are now obligated to collect and remit taxes. And so it's definitely something that we're continuing to keep our eye on. And U.S. tax law is a lot different than VAT. It's some will argue which is more complex, but it's different. And so if you are an indirect tax expert in Germany, as soon as you start dealing with sellers use tax rules in the state of Colorado, it's going to completely go over your head. And so this is definitely a challenge that non-U.S. based sellers are dealing with, and it's something that we can help with.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's an issue that's become really a challenge that's become really critical in recent years as the just share of e-commerce sales has exploded due to everything that's happened in the last few quarters. So really great insight. And any other thoughts with regards to that?
But the only thing I will add is we are seeing, in Europe, we are seeing more of a desire for a tax engine. I think historically, even 5 years ago, I'll say, when I was working on some global projects, the need was, okay, we need a tax engine in North America, but in Europe, we'll just leverage the native tax tables within SAP. And there's definitely been a shift over the past few years, and organizations, and it could be because now organizations are consolidating and they don't have as much in-country expertise as they previously did, or just we've seen accelerate. Historically, rates haven't changed that much, but even with the pandemic, different products had been reduced rated or super reduced, and so there's been more of that product taxability that we typically see in the United States that's crept its way into Europe, and that's just been challenging to maintain within SAP, the continued updates. And so we're seeing more of that, and then those organizations who also sell into the United States will have a requirement based on economic nexus. And so that global story that I usually see from the North American side, where it's North American organization also doing business in Europe, I think we're starting to see the flip side. European organizations have a tax engine requirement for Europe, but now because of Wayfair also have needs. So the geographic lines are really being blurred here, and it goes back to what you're saying. It really is global tax management. These organizations who are doing business, kind of borderless business, they need to make sure they have solutions in place to help them with compliance.
We can get out of. We can kind of close things on this last question. Maybe just provide some. You mentioned best practices. Maybe just provide some takeaways for organizations that are maybe behind in their automation of indirect tax compliance processes and kind of best practices for them.
Yeah, and we have. We've got on our site I think it's 7 steps that organizations should be thinking about when they make their S/4HANA move. I wish I had memorized them, but it's what I would definitely recommend against is implementing a point solution. All right, so there may be challenges now that organizations face that there may be a quick fix for, whether that's deploying a rate file or connecting one engine to an e-commerce system and trying to figure out, okay, we'll worry about this later. I would recommend, especially as part of a migration project, taking a holistic view to tax, really understanding, as I was talking about before, all the different systems in play that could potentially have tax implications, understanding how that data needs to flow through, understanding your exemption certificate management process, understanding what you're doing from a filing perspective, really look at the entire cycle of tax. And figure out where are there inefficiencies, where are there challenges, where would we like to have automation, where we'd like to have consistency across channels and transparency, because there are solutions out there that can provide a single source of truth for determination across all of your channels, taking into consideration the exemption certificates you have on file for your customers, making sure they're kept up to date, and then consolidating all that information so you can either generate extracts to deliver to your accounting firms to do the compliance, or provide a software tool that allows you to walk through and complete those returns. So just because something is always the way it's been, and I think this is something we get into these discussions with clients, well, this is just always the way we've done it. It doesn't mean that there aren't solutions out there to help you to automate it. So I would just recommend taking a holistic view, the indirect tax process, and being open to challenging yourself to what does better look like, and again, talking with other industry experts, advisory firms, folks like us to help paint that picture, because this is indirect tax compliance. It's challenging because it's a necessary component of doing business. It's not something that helps your business make more money, but it is critical in making sure you're doing it correctly, because it can be an inhibitor. And it can be an inhibitor both from a compliance perspective as well as from an efficiency and a cost perspective, just to support. So there are ways to automate, and just be open to automation and be receptive to what's out there in the market.
That's great. Yeah, that's really, I think you hit it on the head, and I know our community is really going to benefit from this conversation. And I want to thank you I want to thank Sovos. I want to thank you for joining us, and really great conversation.